3 Open Letters to William Randolph Hearst. By William F. Dunne. Under the guise of protecting our free American institutions, William Randolph Hearst, through his chain of newspapers and over the radio, is conducting a campaign designed to encourage the most vicious nationalism, sanctifying in the name of Americanism the vicious onslaught being made on the wages, working conditions, unions, and other organizations of the working class. Included in the Hearstian definition of un-American is every single person who does not accept the theory that Morgan, Rockefeller, Mellon, Vanderbilt, Astor, Schwab, Hearst, etc., are the only true representatives of the American people and their interests. The attack on communists and communism by Hearst is intended only to pave the way for an assault on the whole front against every elementary right of the working people in the country. Every economist, every educator, every scientist, every author, every journalist who has spoken favorably of the tremendous advances made in the fields of industry, agriculture, science, and culture by the workers and peasants of the Soviet Union by reason of the victorious revolution and its onward march toward a classless society, is under fire from the Hearst press. Hearst is driving for fascism in the United States, for the destruction of all forms of workers' organizations. He is driving for war as the way out of the crisis for capitalism. He is operating with the knowledge, consent, and approval of the Roosevelt administration. This is WH at the Hearst drive against wages, working conditions, unions, the right to organize, and against communists and communism means. It must be exposed, it must be fought, it must be defeated, or we will find ourselves choking to death under the stinking black pall of fascism. Unity of all working class forces is our only hope in this life and death battle. Forward. How and why Hearst's lackeys lied about Lenin. The deadly parallel. What Lenin really said. The dictatorship of the proletariat is not merely the use of violence against the exploiters, and it is not even mainly the use of violence. Vol. 18, page 361 of Lenin's collected works. What the Hearst papers said. The dictatorship of the proletariat is nothing else than power based on force and limited by nothing, by no kind of law and by absolutely no rule. UNDER the pressure of protest letters from all over the country, and as a result of being confronted with a correct quotation from Lenin on the dictatorship of the proletariat by a delegation from the Chicago Workers' School, the quotation which Hearst's fascist writers like Richard Washburn Child, former United States ambassador to Italy and one of Mussolini's stooges in this country, rewrote to fit Hearst's anti-labor campaign. H.R. Knott, city editor of the Chicago American, told how the campaign started and in addition spilled the beans regarding the integrity of the news and editorial material of the Hearst press. When shown the correct quotation from Lenin, H.R. Knott said, "Why, this is purely historical." He stated further, "You will set no retraction from me. This is not a false statement. It has been quoted and cannot be retracted. Lenin be damned. This is the United States and not Russia. It is really of great insignificance whether we misquote him or not. Who is feeding all the unemployed? Not the communists but the United States of America. If the capitalists are as hard-hearted as the communists make them out to be, why didn't they shoot the unemployed long ago instead of bothering to? However, a new and equally serious fault is developing, and the Hearst papers warn the producers again that if this fault is persisted in, they may expect even more serious difficulties than they have encountered from the criticism of the churches. The objectionable feature of some recent films is their communistic character. If motion pictures are to be used for communistic propaganda, it will be long or the American government will have to step in to censor and suppress such propaganda and directly to supervise the film companies responsible for it and see that they are conducted on a patriotic American basis. Filth on the screen is a matter which may be dealt with by 6. Churches, by parents, and public opinion, but subversive and seditious communistic radicalism calls for direct action by a patriotic government. However, it is to be hoped that the producers have learned something from the storm of protest aroused over immoral films, and will not bring down upon their heads the greater disaster which may result from unfurling the red flag of radicalism. The editorial quoted is a splendid example of your ethics, business code, and political methods. To anyone at all familiar with your particular form of banditry, as thousands of newspapermen and other people are, the implications of the editorial quoted are clear. You are, with that pinch-penny meanness which characterizes your relations with employees excepting those madams of the press, your high-salaried feature writers, and with the other exception of your fabulous expenditures for the gratification of your personal desires, trying with this one editorial to kill 6 birds with one stone. First, the film companies being owned mainly by rich Jews, you are warning them that Hearst papers will not find it difficult to duplicate in this country the Hitlerite demagogic propaganda to the effect that the Jews are the chief backers of communism. Second, you are threatening them with a boycott of any picture which shows the slightest sign of telling the truth about the terrible conditions of millions of American workers and their families, of telling the truth about the Soviet Union, or about the communists and their activities in this country. Third, you are threatening the film firms with government censorship although you yelp loudly about the freedom of the press, meaning, of course, complete freedom for you and your papers to pour out upon a long-suffering people the daily deluge of poison. Fourth, as you always do, in this editorial you cater to the lowest forms of ignorance and prejudice, under the cloak of decency and morality, etc. Fifth, you are notifying the film companies that now is a good time to increase their advertising appropriations for the Hearst papers, or else a polite method of blackmail, to put it mildly. Sixth, and this is the most important political conclusion, you have taken another step in your campaign for the outlawing of the Communist Party as the usual preliminary to a new attack on the organized labor movement, wages and working conditions, and on the living standards of the whole working class, employed and unemployed. 7. The American Method. This method has been sanctified by custom in the strategy board of the class for which you speak, the class whose system and whose greed brought on the present crisis. It was the method followed in 1919-20 when the post-war open shop drive got underway. It was the method followed in 1922 when the open shop drive was extended to the railway shop Kraftnians. It was the method followed in 1923-24 when you, the rest of the employers' press and the government, aided by servile labor officials, foisted the Labor Management Cooperation Plan, efficiency unionism, on the organized labor movement and crippled it for years. What an altruistic savior of humanity in general and American institutions in particular is William Randolph Hearst. Free speech for Hearst. As we have said, Hearst, you are a great advocate of a free press according to your own definition of it. So concerned are you about your free press that you and your chief attorney and mouthpiece John Francis Nillen refuse to recognize the American Newspaper Guild because, you say, it threatens the freedom of the press. You have fired employees with years of service on your papers merely for belonging to and refusing to quit this recognized union of newspapermen. You brought enough pressure to bear on the National Labor Board to get the ruling reinstating Jennings fired by you for membership in the Guild reversed. Oh, yes, you are a great friend of working people providing they agree with your recent editorial statement that they are incapable of running a government. You, Hearst, never earned $1 in your life by work. You inherited a $17 million fortune. There is not a single member of the Communist Party in this country who has not created more goods with his 2 hands and added more to the national wealth of the United States than you have. If every member of the Communist Party had worked only one day in his whole life, this would still be true. Some deadly facts: when you, Hearst, began your campaign for enlarging the detective and spy staff of the Department of Justice, the Communist Party and its press said at once that, under the guise of stamping out crime and gangsterism, you were trying to establish a huge secret political police force in this country, patterned after the Tsar's Okhrana, Mussolini's and Hitler's official bands of spies and terrorists. Once more, we communists did not have to wait long for confirmation from your own correspondence and papers. Your Universal Service, on December 10, 1934, sent out the following from Washington, D.C. A determined drive to outlaw communists and members of other organizations which advocate overthrow of government by force, will be launched in Congress by the House Committee on Un-American Activities, it was learned today. The committee has decided to recommend enactment of this twofold program, a law making it a crime to be affiliated with any organization dedicated to overthrow of the government by force, increased appropriations for the Department of Justice, so its agents may start a nationwide roundup of communists and Nazis. Members of the committee explained existing laws against Reds have been practically nullified because an overt act of violence must be proved before a communist can be convicted. The amendments sponsored by the committee will remove this bar to wholesale prosecution 0/communists. If the Communist Party and its members are automatically outlawed as you and your associates and tools propose, its press, and that of all groups which criticize monopoly capital and its government and its program fundamentally, will also be outlawed. Censorship of the films, prevention of the distribution of leaflets dealing with labor questions and working class political issues, suppression of the entire opposition working class press. This is your program, Hearst. The drive against workers, your campaign against crime, as our press predicted, Hearst, has become a drive against the communists, the labor movement, and the entire working class. It is a means of putting over the new Roosevelt program of reducing living standards, of starving the unemployed to the point where they can be driven into the industries, taking the place of striking workers in many instances, at any wage the employers care to pay. The first 3 points of the new program are: 1. Shift relief responsibilities from the federal government to the states and localities. 2. Concentrate on needed public works which will not conflict with private investment and private industry. 3. Set up unemployment reserves without penalizing industry. 4. Establish broad foreign markets. This can be done only by reducing labor costs, i.e., wages, to a level closer to the European standard, and that of Japan, and making up the difference by speed up of workers. It is an iron law of capitalism, formulated by Marx, that goods tend to sell on the world markets at the figure which represents that of the country having the lowest labor costs, or, rival nations must be crippled or destroyed. War creeps closer. The National Labor Board has just ruled, as this is written, that the Roosevelt decision for the automobile industry endorsed by President Greene of the American Federation of Labor, with his accustomed allegiance to the interests of monopoly capital, which legalized company unions and established the infamous merit clause, a powerful weapon in the hands of the companies against genuine unions and for discrimination and blacklisting of active union men, cannot be reopened. This, together with the points of the new program listed here, shows that you, Hearst, and your heroes, Morgan, Rockefeller, Mellon, Swope, DuPont, Aldrich, ETAI, are organizing a new drive, not only against the communists, but against the entire American working class and its unions. Hearst and Dickstein, it will be useful here, for the benefit of the thousands of people who will read this open letter to you, Hearst, to tell of your relations with Congressman Dickstein, of the House Committee for Investigating Un-American Activities, whose anti-labor recommendations your papers report gleefully, and especially will it be useful for Jewish people in the United States. Congressman Dickstein is a middle-class Jew. He comes from the Lower East Side of New York City, from one of the most poverty-stricken areas of the metropolis. There is a huge Jewish population in his district. The committee of which he is CHAIR 10 was authorized, not to investigate un-American activities, but to investigate the activities of Hitler's fascist agents in this country. But in your Universal Service Washington Dispatch, Hearst, Nazis are mentioned only in passing. It is the communists who are to be outlawed and against whom wholesale prosecution is to be launched. How did this happen? You gathered Dickstein, this ambitious and venal little Democratic Party politician, into your arms, and he now nestles in your bosom. You took him up on the mountain and showed him the world. Your New York sheets had orders to give him plenty of publicity. He got columns of it with his picture run frequently. As a Jew, elevated undeservedly by the Jewish people to prominence, it was his duty to hunt down and expose the Nazi agents in the United States. He devoted little attention to the enemies of his own people and of the working class. He concentrated, together with you, on a drive against the Communists, the only party which fights uncompromisingly and effectively against anti-Semitism. In other words, he double-crossed his own PPLE, that you furnished at least part of the inspiration and justification for this Benedict Arnold-like performance cannot be doubted. People are featured in your papers, Hearst, for only two reasons: you are either boosting them or persecuting them. In both cases your motives are always sordid and anti-social. Hearst's fascist heroes, to return to your signed editorial of December 9, number 1, Public Enemies, in the 41 lines of this front page, to column 12 point type, both sides indented editorial, there are exactly two truthful statements. They are: 1. We recognize Russia. 2. Rights, liberties, opportunities, the people of Russia HND, not under the Tsar. Every other statement in that editorial signed by you, William Randolph Hearst, is a lie. Furthermore, you knew when you wrote that editorial that your statements were lies. Only a person who has doped himself with dreams of unlimited power, actuated by an unquenchable thirst for wealth and still more wealth, blinded by a hatred of the working class, its leaders, its teachers, its organizers, and its organizations that could spring only from class enmity, would broadcast throughout this country statements that tens of thousands of people know, from first-hand knowledge, are outright lies about and slanders of brave and honest men and 11. Women who are trying to make this world a better place to live in for the people who do the work of the world. Your purpose, of course, is obvious, just as it is obvious that you are aping the methods of another one of your heroes, Hitler. Your purpose, Hearst, is the same as that of Hitler and his Nazi murderers, by picturing communists both in the Soviet Union and in the United States as persons who are lower, more vicious, and more degenerate than the most depraved criminals. As Hitler and his murder gangs used the same method against communists, militant workers and Jews, you hope to create the necessary moral justification for a new onslaught on communists first, and on the entire labor movement next, by government agencies and fascist bands. You say, Hearst, it is the same old Russia as under the Tsars. It is the same old tyranny under a different name. If this is so, why do you continually denounce the Soviet Union, its workers' and farmers' government, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and Stalin, its leader? You never had any quarrel with the Tsar. He was one of our gallant allies in 1917. You never miss an opportunity to say something in praise of Hitler and Mussolini. You always try to picture Stalin as an absolute dictator and the Soviet government as the personal dictatorship of Stalin and a handful of communists. When you speak of dictatorships you include Stalin with Hitler and Mussolini. But you know you lie, and we know you lie. If the Soviet government were a one-man dictatorship you would have no quarrel with it. It is not the abstract question of dictatorship versus democracy that irks you, Hearst. In your own field you are a despot and you are trying to enlarge your field. You have stated openly in your papers, in a signed editorial, that a fascist dictatorship is the remedy for communism. Why Hearst hates the Soviet government? What accounts for your unlimited hatred of the Soviet government and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union? Why are they, and not the dictatorships of Hitler and Mussolini, who rode to power by murder, torture and suppression of the workers, their leaders and their organizations, the target of your barrages of anti-working class venom? The answer is obvious to any intelligent person, regardless of his political opinions. Hitler and Mussolini changed nothing. 12. Except the JORM and methods OJ government. The Russian workers and poor peasants changed the class content of their government. The working class, with its Communist Party at its head, took over government power in alliance with the poor peasantry and the oppressed national minorities including the Jews. In Germany and Italy the princes and nobility remain to prey on the people. They still have their estates, and royalty in Italy and Germany still gets its subsidies of millions of dollars, all wrung from the toil and sweat and suffering of the working population. The government in these countries has dropped all the democratic trappings with which the ever-present dictatorship of capital was disguised when it served its purposes best to do so. Hitler and Mussolini are dictators only by grace of the biggest bankers and industrial lords whose interests are interlocked in this era of finance capital. The real power in the countries remains where it always was, in the hands of a small group of coal, iron and steel, oil and chemical kings and financial overlords. They and their fascist governments are supported by you, Hearst, and by their capitalist kindred in this country. Mussolini, for instance, could not have lasted a YE3R without huge loans from Wall Street banks. Wall Street loans backed every step of the reactionary parade toward the present fascist murder regime in Germany. It is not the same old Russia as under the Tsars, and you know it. That is why you hate it. You could travel the length and breadth of the Soviet Union and not find a capitalist or any other private employer living on the labor of others. The highest paid people in the Soviet Union are foreign engineers working for the Soviet government. In the last year, Amturg, the Soviet-American trading company with headquarters in New York City, has received something like 100,000 applications for employment in the Soviet Union, mainly filth on his name and on his sepulcher. You do this, Hearst, you, in whose whole life there is not the record of one decent or unselfish act. In spite of all difficulties and hardships resulting from the dislocations of the economic structure during the war and invasions after the revolution, many of them the result of the blockades, boycotts and interventions by the imperialist powers and their agents in the Soviet Union, the masses of the Russian people support the dictatorship of the proletariat headed by the Communist Party because they know that no capitalist or group of capitalists is robbing them of the fruits of their labor. They know that the gigantic basic industries that have been developed and those in process of development are for the benefit of the community, not, as in the capitalist countries, including the United States, mainly for the benefit of a small section of the population, the capitalists and their hangers-on. 15. This is another established and widely known fact. It has been stated over and over again by thousands of engineers, scientists, social workers, writers, and economists of all nations, most of whom do not believe in the theory and tactics of the communist parties in their own countries. You, Hearst, know that this is true. Hearst's object: over a long period your papers have been publishing what purports to be Lenin's definition of communism. As a matter of fact, your cartoonist Harding gave Lenin's definition of C01 as the dictatorship of the proletariat is nothing else than power based upon force and limited by nothing, by no kind of law and by absolutely no rule. You, Hearst, are not worried about sympathy for communism among members of your own class. You are worried by the appeal that communism is making to the working class and certain sections 01, the ruined middle class. You dare not tell the truth about either communism or the proletarian dictatorship because of this fact. Therefore, you put words into the mouth of the greatest organizer and leader of the working class that ever lived that he never wrote or uttered. You defile the memory of our Lenin. I will prove here that you lie in regard to Lenin's definition of communism and the dictatorship of the proletariat. That your lie is a deliberate one is shown by the fact that Lenin's State and Revolution, published in August 1917, only 3 months before the working class took power, contains Lenin's most detailed description of the form, methods, and purposes of the proletarian dictatorship. Almost exactly a year after the victorious revolution headed by the Bolsheviks, a second edition was published in Moscow December 1918 with this terse preface by Lenin. The present, second, edition is published almost without change. Paragraph 3 has been added to Chapter 2 PR of that Hearst lied deliberately. This is what Lenin says of the proletarian dictatorship in his fundamental work on the subject. Between capitalist and communist society, Marx continues the period of the revolutionary transformation of the former into 16. The latter. To this also corresponds a political transition period, in which the state can be no other than the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. What, then, is the relationship to democracy? In capitalist society, under the conditions most favorable for its development, we have a more or less complete democracy in the democratic republic. But this democracy is always bound by the narrow framework of capitalist exploitation, and consequently always remains, in reality, a democracy for the minority, only for the possessing classes, only for the rich. Freedom in capitalist society always remains just about the same as it was in the ancient Greek republics, freedom lore the slave owners. It is necessary to emphasize this point because this is exactly your conception of democracy, Hearst. More and more your papers, your high-salaried special pleaders, and all the privileged hangers-on of American imperialism for whom you speak, drive harder daily to put over this conception of democracy, democracy for yourselves but dictatorship over the working class. If, continues Lenin, we look more closely into the mechanism of capitalist democracy, everywhere, both in the so-called petty details of the suffrage residential qualifications, exclusion of women, etc., and in the technique of the representative institutions, in the actual obstacles to the right of assembly, in the purely capitalist organization of the daily press, etc., etc. On all sides we see restriction after restriction upon democracy. These restrictions, exceptions, exclusions, obstacles for the poor, seem slight, especially in the eyes of one who has himself never known want and has never been in close contact with the oppressed classes in their mass life, but in the sum total these restrictions exclude and squeeze out the poor from politics and from an active share in democracy. Marx splendidly grasped this essence of capitalist democracy, when, in analyzing the experience of the Commune, he said that the oppressed were allowed, once in every few years, to decide which particular representatives of the oppressing class should be in Parliament to represent and repress them. The facts of life in America today prove this statement. One question here, Hearst, answer this question truthfully. If there is any truth in your fascist organism, has President Roosevelt, by birth, fortune, training, and con viction, anything in common with the masses of the people of this country who work for wages or moderate salaries? You know he has not. His latest program, outlined in his message to the Congress, is a program for more intense exploitation of the working people. It calls for cutting millions of unemployed from federal relief rolls, throwing them back on bankrupt states and cities. It proposes such low wages for relief work that workers will be glad to take jobs in industries at practically any wage the employers decide to pay. It is more open and vicious than the first NRA program, but it still does not go far enough in this direction to satisfy you, Hearst. You want, and are campaigning for, fascism in this country now. It is true that you have not as yet dropped all your democratic demagogy, that you still speak of Americanism as synonymous with democracy for all the people, but your continual and systematic slandering of the working class, your press and publicity alliance with the most reactionary elements in American life today, whose statements approving of your attacks both on the American working class and the working class and its government in the Soviet Union your papers publish at length show that you are preparing to drop all pretense of democracy, except, of course, a democracy of slave owners. The dictatorship of the proletariat, Marx, Engels, and Lenin show, does away with this slave owner democracy. That is why you hate the working class and communism. Lenin wrote further. Again, during the transition from capitalism to communism, suppression is still necessary, but it is the suppression 01 the minority 01 exploiters by the majority 01 the exploited. This is compatible with the diffusion 01 democracy among such an overwhelming major ity 01 the population, that the need for a special machinery of suppression will begin to disappear. These extended extracts from Lenin's description of the dictatorship of the proletariat, why it is necessary, how it works, and how it disappears when no longer needed, give quite a different picture of communist theory and practice than your fascist lies. It has been stated that you lied deliberately. The proof of this is that State and Revolution is one of Lenin's best-known works. It has been on sale in this coup 11 try for at least 14 years in eve.rr city of any size, and is to be found in all libraries. 18. Worthy of the name. You know this. But your object is to poison, not to enlighten, the minds of those who have not read State and Revolution, to poison the minds of workers especially. Once more I say to you that you are following the methods of Hitler and his sadistic stormtroopers recruited from the cesspools of the underworld. The work of a provocateur. Let's return now to your signed editorial of December 9, number 1, Public Enemies. Taking the foul murder of Kirov, one of the great leaders of the working class revolution in Russia, as your text, although not mentioning it directly, you endeavor to whip your readers into fury, not against the members of the former nobility, not against the organizations and members of the counter-revolutionary White Guards, aided and abetted by the agents of the imperialist powers, who plotted and carried out this murder, but against the Soviet government, against the proletarian dictatorship, against the CPSU and its leaders. You say, there is the same old protest by assassination against cruelty and tyranny. There is the same old wholesale massacre of opponents / the despotism, whether those slaughtered be guilty or innocent of crime. Rights, liberties, opportunities, the people of Russia had not under the Tsar and have not under Stalin. What is it, exactly, that you are doing here? You, Hearst, are attempting to justify and condone the murder, by agents of Tsarist and imperialist reaction, of Kirov, a worker revolutionist, 30 years of whose life had been spent in organizing his fellow workers, in teaching them, in leading them through heroic struggles to victory. Years of his life had been spent in Tsarist prisons and in Siberian exile. Kirov was a worker, an organizer, a fighter, a revolutionist, a hero. He was a communist, a pupil and a comrade of Lenin. He was everything that you are not and never could he. He was a man. Hearst chooses real representatives for the Russian masses. Your heroes in the Soviet Union today are not these men and women of the working class, or those intellectuals who at the turn of the century identified themselves inseparably with the working class, who braved all the terror of the Tsar and his secret 19. Police to win freedom for the working population. Hearst hails the princes according to your theory, by which any foul act against the Soviet government, its leaders and supporters can be justified. The real representative of the people of the Soviet Republic of Georgia, for instance, is not the Georgian revolutionist Joseph Stalin but the family of Georgian ex-princes, the Mdivanese. The Russian people, with the exception of the comparatively few out of 170 million who still dream feudal dreams of the conquest of the Soviet Union by imperialist and monarchist reaction, hate with the same implacable hatred all attempts to restore the old tyranny and the Tsarist rule of blood and iron. This is exactly what the conspirators who murdered Kirov were trying to do. You know it, Hearst. We know you know it. That is why you rush into print in their defense. They plot and raise funds for their printed slanders of the Soviet Union in Washington and New York with the knowledge of the US government, just as they do in all the European and Far Eastern capitals. They raise money in the US for their campaigns of sabotage and murder in the Soviet Union. You know that this is so. LT was different with King Alexander. Let us make a comparison here with another recent assassination, the assassination of King Alexander of Yugoslavia, which brought southeastern Europe to the verge of a new war and which contained the threat of a new world war. King Alexander was the head of monarchical fascism in the kingdom of the Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, one of the economic 20. Political and territorial abortions of the peace treaties of Versailles, Saint-Germain, and Trianon. King Alexander carved a crimson record for himself in the flesh and bone of the working class and peasantry of Yugoslavia. He wrote in the blood of the Croatian national minority a chapter of history so horrible as to make the flesh creep. One has to go back to the decadent days of the Roman Empire to find a parallel to it. The fascist Alexander massacred, jailed and tortured to death, killed by secret assassination not hundreds, but thousands of workers and peasants. The best and bravest of the working population were butchered off like sheep in a slaughterhouse to preserve the world. Since the death of Lenin, not the trials and executions of the murder conspirators, was the real answer to the murder of their leader and comrade of the workers and peasantry of the land of the proletarian dictatorship where, you say, Hearst, there is the same old tyranny under a different name. You lie, of course, and you know you lie. 22. Some established and well-known facts. It is an established fact, well known to thousands of students of economics and politics in the Soviet Union who are not communists, that giant steps have been taken toward the abolition of classes in the Soviet Union. It is expected that by the end of the second five-year plan social classes will have been eliminated entirely. The land has been nationalized. The collective farms now embrace by far the greater proportion of the agricultural industry in all its branches together with the Soviet farms. The wealthy peasantry, which was the wellspring of capital accumulation at the expense of the poor peasantry and the working class, is no longer a powerful economic and social force. All factory industry is nationalized. So are telephone and telegraph. So are the railways. So is shipping. So is the raw material industry, mining, oil wells and refining, lumbering, fishing, etc. So is the electric light and power industry. So is printing and publishing, with the exception of the trade union press. The robbery of workers through private and corporate ownership of the natural resources, the factories and machines has been abolished. The surplus produced by workers over and above their wages goes into the common fund for developing more natural resources, building and expanding the huge industries that amaze the engineers of the capitalist countries, into more and better dwellings, schools, universities, rest homes for workers, parks, playgrounds, nurseries, hospitals, etc., all of which are, not the property of rich and idle capitalists, but of the whole community, the property of the nation and its people. This is the economic and social foundation of the proletarian dictatorship. Hearst's despotism. You are, apparently, very fond of the words despot and despotism, when applied to the Soviet government, the dictatorship of the proletariat. In fascist Germany and Italy, schools and universities are being closed. In the Soviet Union, new schools and universities and scientific academies are being opened daily. In 12 years of fascism under Mussolini, there has not been produced a single scientific, artistic, literary, or cultural achievement of any merit. 23. Every intelligent person in the world knows that fascism in Spain, Yugoslavia, and Germany drove and continues to drive the whole cultural level back toward that of the Middle Ages and even further back towards barbarism. But the achievements of the people of the Soviet Union in biology, medicine, and surgery, in Arctic exploration, in meteorology, in agriculture, in the theater and moving pictures, in the field of literature, in music, in chemistry, in ethnology, etc., have amazed the world. There is systematic education of the whole people in the elementary requirements: reading, writing and arithmetic. Before the revolution, something like 80% of the population was illiterate. Today, only about 10% are unable to read and write, and, by the end of the second five-year plan, it is believed that no one except the very old people will be unable to read and write. These are strange things for a despotism to be doing. Since Marxism-Leninism is the theory and practice of the working class revolution, since it furnishes a guide for the policies and tactics of the daily struggles of workers and their organizations against the constant encroachments of capital, as well as to the policies, program, and tactics of the decisive struggle for government power by the working class, despotism which educates the masses in Marxism-Leninism would simply be preparing its own speedy downfall. There are something like 20 million workers in the Soviet Union organized in industrial unions. It was Lenin who described the unions as the main basis of the Soviet government. You, Hearst, contend that workers and their elected representatives from unions and other organizations, from factory councils, etc., cannot run industry and government. But life itself has disproved your fascist contention. Production up in Soviet Union, down under capitalism, while the national economy of all other nations is on the downgrade, or remains frozen at a crisis level. Production and distribution in the Soviet Union go rapidly and steadily upward. Its production of basic commodities now exceeds that of any continental European nation, in some industries its production 24 exceeds that of the United States. Workers and a workers' government can and do run industry, agriculture, and government in a country twice the size of the United States, with a population exceeding that of this country by 45 million. They run it far better in all respects than the capitalist governments do. This kind of a despotism through which more millions of working people find expression, work, hope, education of the highest type, and constant advance toward still higher social and cultural levels than ever before in human history, is the dictatorship of the proletariat, led by its Communist Party, of which the murdered Sergei Kirov was one of the outstanding leaders. Where Hearst's sympathies are you, Hearst, are greatly exercised over the death sentences passed on the conspirators after Kirov's murder. But you carefully avoid any mention of the tens of thousands of communists, workers, and peasants and their leaders resisting fascist and imperialist oppression throughout the whole world, who have been shot down, jailed, tortured and murdered in hideous ways that only the degenerate mercenaries and hangers-on of the capitalist class can devise when egged on to their horrid deeds by the rulers and beneficiaries of a decaying system determined to hang on to power and privilege, even though it means that the blood of millions of slaughtered workers and poor farmers rises above the foundations of the capitalist structure. No classless society for them. After the end of the first five-year plan, many of the restrictions placed by the Soviet government on the activities of former members of the nobility, former employers, on various groups of the intellectuals of the old regime, were relaxed. The answer of the counter-revolutionists to this new step toward a classless society was the murder of Kirov. This is what you, Hearst, call the same old protest by assassination against cruelty and tyranny. This is what you say is the result of the same old implacable hatred by the people of Yule by blood and 25. Iron. You, Hearst, your heroes are the counter-revolutionary murderers, they are the enemies of the people. Your heroes are white guards and their allies who want to bring back the old reactionary rule by blood and iron. You know, Hearst, and we know you know, that if the Soviet government would open up the vast rich territory and hand over the 170 million people for exploitation by capitalists of the imperialist countries, if it were to denationalize industry, dissolve the unions, if it were to liquidate its government monopoly of foreign trade, in other words, if it were to cease to be a government of, by, and for the working class and its allies, the peasantry and national minorities, if it were to become the despotism you try to picture it, you would hail Stalin and the communists as the greatest statesmen in the world. It is the working class content of the Soviet government that you hate. At the risk of some repetition, it is necessary to say that you prove the case against you over and over again. How? It is a matter of common knowledge that in fascist Germany and Italy the unions have been destroyed. It is a matter of common knowledge that wages have been reduced again and again. It is a matter of common knowledge that there are huge armies of unemployed in these countries and that unemployment is increasing. It is a matter of common knowledge that unemployment relief has been reduced again and again. It is a matter of common knowledge that in these fascist countries workers have no rights whatsoever. It is a matter of common knowledge that Hitler and Mussolini keep the air throbbing with threats of war, that fascism contains today the greatest menace of a new world war. Hearst the warmonger. Yet you and your press miss no opportunity to apologize for and even praise fascist regimes. The preliminary engagements of a new imperialist war are being fought now, by Japan against the Chinese people in Manchuria and Inner Mongolia, by various imperialist-backed forces. 26. In Central Asia, by Italian imperialism against Abyssinia, by American and British imperialism using the puppet governments of Bolivia and Paraguay in carrying on the bloody war in the Gran Chaco, etc. The new war is also being prepared by you, Hearst, your papers and your fascist heroes and associates by exactly the kind of anti-Soviet and anti-working class agitation and propaganda contained in your signed editorial of December 1934. It is essentially war propaganda intended to establish the moral justification for new onslaughts against the Soviet Union and all workers who defend the First Proletarian Republic, against all people who denounce and resist your war propaganda and program and your drive for fascist suppression of the press, unions, and other organizations of the working population fighting against the growing power of monopoly capital and its steady reduction of mass living standards. Such a program must be resisted or slavery accepted. Hearst, in American history, it would be very nice if your implied contention, although put forward with studied hypocrisy in your signed editorial, were true. You ask the rhetorical question. Is it not about time for all of us Americans to realize that peace and progress and happiness only thrive in the soil of liberty and free democracy? There are three main points to be considered here. First, that there was a time in this country when there was comparative peace, undoubted technical and economic progress and some measure of popular happiness, this, in spite of the fact that even in the best of times a considerable section of the population lived at or near the poverty level. Second, how was this condition brought about? What were the causes? Third, where is peace and progress and happiness today for the majority of the American population? Inveighing against the execution of aristocratic and imperialist-inspired murderers and murder conspirators in the Soviet Union, you refrain with the greatest meticulousness from any analogy American history furnishes. 27. No ruling class ever voluntarily surrendered its privileged position. No important nation or people has ever won freedom from subjection to another without struggle in all these fields. This holds true for the 13 colonies from which grew the United States in the Revolutionary War against England, by which political independence was gained and a form of government, new to the world at that time, established. Some facts about the American Revolution. It is known to all real students of American history that the war for independence was fought chiefly by laborers and mechanics, by pioneer farmers and frontiersmen. It is a historical fact that the majority of the wealthy people were opposed to the war and supported the English whenever possible. The revolutionary government and army found it necessary to take special repressive measures against these counter-revolutionists. Many of them were shot, hanged, or imprisoned. Others had their property confiscated. The formal history that is taught in American schools says nothing about the clash of social forces in the Revolutionary War. It says nothing about the division of opinion among the colonial population on the issue of independence. Every attempt is made to picture the war for independence as having the unanimous support of the entire population. It is a false picture. For instance, merchants, plantation proprietors, and ship owners who would not furnish supplies to the hungry, ill-clad and poorly armed continental armies, sold supplies to the British at good prices. A revolution is either right or wrong according to which side one is on. You, Hearst, are against the working class revolution, because it would deprive you and your class of privilege and power, of the PFWER to rob and rule the overwhelming majority of the population which works for a living or hungers when industry shuts down because no profit can be made. One expects you to oppose the transfer of power from the capitalist class and its government to the working class, its allies, and its government. But do not try to base your opposition on moral grounds when it springs solely from a desire to hang on to wealth you never created and to power too enormous lure one man. 28. To wield power that comes from your property and not FR0111, your ability and achievements. Revolutions spring from necessity. They cannot be made artificially. It was so with the American Revolution against the English monarchy. It was so with the Russian Revolution against Tsarism and capitalism. Both had to suppress people and classes who opposed, sabotaged, and aided the enemy against the purposes of the revolution. The wealthy groups who supported and led the revolution wanted only freedom from the monarchy and the abolition of the restrictions it placed on their development as a ruling class. The poor people, who furnished the bulk of the colonial fighting forces, wanted their economic burdens lifted. They wanted the opening up of the frontier for their small farms, etc., by which they were enabled to escape from the status of indentured and bond servants and poorly paid wage laborers. But hundreds of former soldiers were thrown into prison for debt after the war. It was not until 1830 that the property qualification for the franchise was partially abolished 50 years after the end of the War for Independence. It was only after the lapse of about 6 decades that free public schools began to be established. These reforms were secured only by bitter struggle. At the Constitutional Convention there was not a single representative of the poor people. The only person who spoke in their behalf was Benjamin Franklin. The war for independence was progress, and the defeat of the monarchy made possible a higher stage of society. At the same time it entrenched rising capitalism and the young capitalist class in positions of power in the northern states. The American counter-revolution, the American Revolution, however, did not disturb the southern aristocracy whose wealth was based on chattel slavery of Negroes. Part of this semi-feudal class was allied with the revolutionary forces. George Washington was one of them. Chattel slavery continued. But it became more and more incompatible with the growing capitalism of the North, the increase of factory production and the convention was secret. Its proceedings were never made public. Nothing would have been known of them had not James Madison kept a diary which was published after his death. 29. The free farmers of the westward moving frontier. There were constant clashes between the reactionary chattel slavery landlord class and the northern capitalists whose system was based on wage labor and in that period represented progress. Efforts were made to extend chattel slavery to the newly organized and settled territories Missouri, Kansas, etc. The Southern slaveholders carried on a constant struggle in and out of Congress for chattel slavery under the guise of states' rights. The legislation of this period represents a compromise between the interests of the slaveholders, those of the increasingly powerful capitalist class, and those of the frontier groups. By 1860 it had become impossible to reconcile the interests of the two diametrically opposed economic systems. This brought on the Civil War or, as Southern historians and politicians refer to it, the war between the states. The Southern ruling class started the war. They started an armed insurrection against progress, Hearst. They started armed counter-revolution. They received moral, financial, and material support from wealthy Englishmen and from the English government. It is an established fact that negotiations were carried on with the British Foreign Office, leading at least to an alliance of the Confederacy with Britain, and probably some such an arrangement for dominion status as now exists between Canada and Britain. This counter-revolution, to defend and maintain the institution of chattel slavery and semi-feudal state governmental forms, to maintain a system which even antedates feudalism, was put down by armed force in a war that lasted over 4 years. The most severe repressive measures were taken by the Union government after the war to prevent a new counter-revolutionary outbreak. The basis was laid for drawing the Southern states into the orbit of American capitalism. Therefore, it is clear that the question of what class, slave-owning landlords or capitalists, was to rule the American nation after it had gained political independence was not settled by the Revolutionary War. This question was not definitely settled until 75 years after the Revolutionary War, and it took a far larger and bloodier war to settle it then. Bimba, History 01 The American Labor Movement, International Publishers, New York City, O'Neill, Workers in American History, A. M. Simons, Class Struggles Il American History. 30. Yet you, Hearst, denounce in unmeasured terms the Soviet government for proceeding on a far smaller scale, and with 1/1000th part of the cost in lives, in much the same manner that Northern capitalism proceeded against the Southern slaveholders and their counter-revolutionary attacks. Only 17 years have elapsed since the proletarian revolution in Russia. This was not merely a nation establishing its independence from another nation, nor was it the rise of capitalist democracy without a monarch. It was a revolution in the fullest sense of the word, the replacement of the monarchy, the feudal nobility and the capitalist class as the ruling classes, by the working class. The Russian Revolution could have occurred only because the capitalist system has outlived its usefulness. Capitalism, beginning as a system of progress, now threatens to drive the human race back to barbarism. The Civil War placed American capitalism in the saddle. It had to share its power with no other system, but it left the Negro people still enslaved. Today they are a subject race doubly oppressed, especially in the South. They have no rights that the ruling class is bound to respect, not even the right to vote for representatives of the ruling class. In this sense the proletarian revolution in Russia was also complete. It freed and gave full equality to the national and racial minorities who were enslaved under the Tsar. Just as the ruling classes, the capitalists, the kings, and the nobility, of most European countries supported the counter-revolution of the Southern slaveholders, while Karl Marx, the International Workingmen's Association, and the working class especially of England aided the war against it, so today the monarchs, the nobility, and the capitalist classes of all countries without exception, slander, conspire and engage in counter-revolutionary acts against the Soviet Union and the proletarian dictatorship. but to a greater extent than in the case of the Civil War. Millions of workers, their organizations, and their allies, the Negro people, the colonial peoples, poor farmers, support and will defend the First Workers' Republic against all enemies, including William Randolph Hearst. *C. Address of International Workingmen's Association drafted by Marx and sent to President Lincoln. 31. A third open letter to William Randolph Hearst. William Randolph Hearst. Generous patron and genial. Overlord to all well known. Writers willing to sell their abilities to the robbers and oppressors of poor people. Greetings. On January 5 you delivered, over a national hookup under the auspices of the NBC, an address you called Government by the Proletariat. This speech was published the next day by all your daily papers. You called the statements made in this speech, composed of deliberately fabricated lies, half-truths, and distortions of facts, the plain uncensored truth. You took as your text the murder of Sergei Kirov, over which you gloated, and the execution of members of the riffraff of counter-revolution carried cut by the Soviet government. You said, 117 so-called conspirators have been executed for protest against what they call a government of cruelty and incompetence. Why won't your papers, your special writers like Richard Washburn-Child, Isaac Don Levine, etc., tried to make popular heroes of these White Guard conspirators, the murderers of Kirov, and of their allies and dupes operating in various circles in and out of the Soviet Union? Your own papers refuted you. Unfortunately for you, Hearst, the same issue of your papers which published your broadcast carried the following Associated Press Moscow dispatch. 32. Moscow, January 5. Pravda, Communist Party organ, charged editorially today that an unidentified big country was behind the small country whose consul was recalled allegedly for giving money to Leonid Nikolaev, executed for the murder of Sergei Kirov. The newspaper said the unnamed country was preparing by means of violence to change the present frontiers of Europe. After reviewing Nikolaev's announced testimony that he prepared documents in an effort to make it appear that the murder was a crime of personal despair, Pravda said it was curious that exactly the same position was taken by the German press, which repeated that Nikolaev acted through personal motives. So, Hearst, something else besides arrests and executions took place in the Soviet Union after the vile murder of Kirov, which you welcomed and condoned. A consul was deported. He was deported for financing the murder of Kirov and for other counter-revolutionary acts. It is clear from the above dispatch that back of the Latvian consul stood German fascism, another government of monopoly capitalism's gangsters which you boost and defend at every opportunity. Truth has no charm for you. You, Hearst, are enough of a politician to know that such charges as those made by Pravda and quoted in the AP dispatch are not made lightly, nor are foreign consuls recalled without reason. Up to date, the Latvian government has made no public defense or explanation of the recall of its Leningrad consul. It has maintained a guilty silence. But for you, Hearst, the truth has no charm when it comes to the question of laying the basis for an extension of the use of fascist measures against the working class of this country, against its organizations, and for discrediting the Soviet Union and its proletarian government as a step toward war on it by your friend Hitler and your latest savior of civilization, Japanese imperialism, whose every war threat against the Soviet Union you applaud. Your witnesses and your proofs in your broadcast, attempting to prove your major premise that the working class cannot and must not be allowed to govern, that it is the least able successfully to manage its own affairs, that in ancient Rome this class was without property of any kind. 33. And without the constructive or executive ability to acquire any, you pretend to show that the counter-revolutionary murder conspiracy had its roots in mass resentment against constantly worsening economic conditions. You drew a picture of mass starvation in the land of the proletarian dictatorship. You made your case by accepting the statements of one Dr. Ewald Amend, a White Guard and fascist ally, as the truth, and by misquoting, distorting, and making a liar out of Harold Denny, Moscow correspondent of the New York Times, a dirty piece of business in which you managed to surpass even your usual sliminess. Who is this Dr. Amend? He calls himself the chairman of the Vienna Aid Committee. He is connected with the Skoropadsky group of Ukrainian White Guards. This committee is an agency of Italian and Austrian fascism and of the hierarchy of the Catholic Church for carrying on propaganda against the Soviet Union under the guise of aiding famine victims. Dr. Emmend maintains close relations with the fascist Cardinal Eniza of Vienna. It was almost at the very moment that the fascist Dollfuss was shooting down Vienna workers and their families in Vienna that the Vienna Aid Committee intensified their propaganda against the Soviet Union. For you, Hearst, Dr. Emmend is an authority on starvation in the Soviet Union. You quoted him liberally. You did more than that. You worked in a few quotations from Harold Denny's dispatches to make it appear that this New York Times correspondent corroborated Dr. Emmend's lies. The exact opposite is the case. Denny proved you lie. In a letter to the New York Times in August, 1934, Dr. Emmend stated that people were dying of starvation in the streets of Kiev, in the southern Ukraine. The Times evidently received sufficient protests against this outright lie to cause it to cable its Moscow correspondent for a statement. On August 23, 1934, Harold Denny cabled an unreserved denial of Emmend's statements. Denny cabled, "This statement certainly has no foundation. Your correspondent was in Kiev several days last July about the time people were supposed to be dying there, and neither in the city nor in the surrounding countryside was there hunger." 34. On October 15, 1934, Denny cabled as follows. "Nowhere was such twaddle, says the free and happy. McIntyre, is dandy stuff for soap. Box spewers of sedition, but it is unvarnished bunk. Oh, mostly it's the venom of newspaper failures. Here we have it, Hearst. It is not only uth at you are driving it. You are us to kill off all expert, Zion of insurgent opinion among people who work for wages." 2. SAHAFPUB Lee SH 37. ERS Color News, that newspapermen are made to write, or have their stuff rewritten to suit the aims of profit-making institutions, is twaddle. Such statements are fit-only rights. The word dictatorship means the abolition of democracy. In the first place, this is not a definition. If Kautsky wanted to avoid giving a definition of the concept of dictatorship, why did he choose this particular approach to the question? Secondly, it is obviously wrong. A liberal naturally speaks of democracy in general, but a Marxist will never forget to ask, for aha, class? Everybody knows, for instance, that the rebellions of and even the strong ferment among the slaves in antiquity immediately revealed the fact that in essence the state of antiquity was the dictatorship of the slave owners. Did this dictatorship abolish democracy among and for the slave owners? Everybody knows that it did not. The Marxist, Kautsky, uttered absolute nonsense and an untruth, because he forgot the class struggle. In order to transform Kautsky's liberal and lying assertion into a Marxian and true one must say, dictatorship does not necessarily mean the abolition of democracy for the class that exercises dictatorship over other classes, but it certainly does mean the abolition of democracy for that class over which, or against which, the dictatorship is exercised. But, however true this assertion may be, it does not give a definition of dictatorship. As a result, we find that having undertaken to discuss dictator 40. Ship, Kautsky has said a great deal which is contrary to truth, but has not given us a definition. Yet, without trusting his mental faculties, he could have had recourse to his memory and taken from his pigeonholes all those instances when Marx spoke of the dictatorship. Had he done so, he would certainly have arrived either at the following definition, or one in the main coinciding with it. Dictatorship is power, based directly upon force, and unrestricted by any laws. The revolutionary dictatorship 01 the proletariat is power won and maintained by the violence 01 the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, power that is unrestricted by any laws. And this simple truth, a truth that is as plain as noonday to every class-conscious worker, this truth, which is obvious to every representative of the exploited classes which are fighting for their emancipation, this truth, which is indisputable for every Marxist, has to be extorted by force from the most learned gentleman, Mr. Kautsky. If Kautsky had wanted to argue in a serious and honest manner, he would have asked himself, are there historical laws governing revolution which know of no exception? And the reply would have been, no, no such laws exist. These laws only apply to what is typical, to what Marx once termed the ideal, in the sense of an average, normal, typical capitalism. Further, was there in the 70s of last century anything which made England and America an exception in regard to what we are now discussing? It will be obvious to anyone familiar with the requirements of science in the domain of historical problems that such a question must be put. To fail to put it is tantamount to falsifying science, to engaging in sophistry. And the question having been put, there can be no doubt as to the reply: the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat is violence against the bourgeoisie, and the necessity for such violence is particularly created, as Marx and Engels have repeatedly explained in detail, by the existence of militarism and bureaucracy. But it is precisely these institutions that were non-existent in England and America in the 70s of the 19th century when Marx made his observations. Having placed the correct quotation from his polemic against Kautsky in its proper position, it is clear as daylight that Lenin is purposely emphasizing the suppressive side precisely because such necessary measures of the revolutionary struggle were what Kautsky was trying to conceal and distorting Marx for this purpose. Who makes force necessary? Communists are not blind worshippers of force. But only communists have fully grasped the historical truth that force exercised by the organized working class is necessary for the victory of the proletarian revolution. This is so not because communists will it, but because the capitalist class and its hangers-on never have and never will refrain from the use of armed force of all suppressive instruments of capitalist government against the working class to maintain their robber rule. You, Hearst, say that the working class is composed mainly of fools. But only a fool or incurable liberals and reformists can believe that a working class such as the American working class, meeting always in its daily struggles just for a little more butter on its bread, the force and violence of the military forces, police, bands of corporation-paid gangsters and the vigilante squads whom you delight in hailing as the saviors of American institutions, that daily faces in its fight to maintain even the present hunger standard of wages, gas, machine guns, shotguns and clubs in the hands of mercenaries recruited by the various agencies of monopoly capital, will retain many illusions regarding a peaceful transfer of government power from the capitalist class to the working class. The hard lesson of fascism. The rise of fascism, the state power of capitalism in decay, is wiping out the last of the illusions regarding democratic processes. A working class leader who does not understand and teach these historical truths, a working class leader in America today who does not point out to his fellow workers that, as Lenin does in the last sentence quoted, the conditions which might have made possible a relatively peaceful transfer of power in the United States and England have vanished with the advent of imperialism, and that in their place stands the capitalist class with its specially organized and constantly expanding instruments of suppression, is a menace to his class and can lead it nowhere except to disastrous defeat. This is the hard lesson taught by every important strike and 42. By every revolutionary struggle of the working class and its allies from the Paris Commune 65 years ago, through the victorious Russian Revolution, to the present date. These dull and degenerate Reds, and now, Hearst, we come to the conclusion of this correspondence. We have not forgotten that in your editorials you said that communists were more dangerous than criminals and more dull and degenerate than the imbeciles. Dangerous? Yes. To the entrenched privileges and private ownership of the fabulous wealth sweated from millions of toilers whom you and your class claim the right to rule forever, yes. Dangerous to working people and their class interests? No. If we were, you would be shrilling our praises louder than you now yelp for outlawing and suppressing us. Who are criminals and degenerates? No, Hearst, these are not dullards and degenerates, not criminals, and well you know it. You are trying to bulwark the class enmity of your capitalist kindred and its hangers-on with the terrible weapons of brutal ignorance and savage prejudice. You are sowing the wind, and you and your class will reap the whirlwind. Just who are you to speak so carelessly of criminals and degenerates, and apply these terms to workers and their laborers? At the very beginning we said that the usual rules of political debate do not serve in formulating a reply to you. You do not come into court with clean hands. Before you became so powerful, Hearst, powerful enough to couch your form in a White House bedchamber errating the necessity for the president to burn down his residence in order to purify it, before you became powerful enough to insult Rasputin like the decent people of a whole nation by being entertained by its head, 8 peculiar things happened. Perhaps you remember, Hearst, that some 2 decades ago a small California community Sausalito earned lasting honor for itself because, sickened by the continual orgies in your palatial home, whose stench drifted over the whole town, the citizenry rose almost as one man and forced you to leave. Perhaps you also remember that you were expelled from the 43 Pacific Union Club of San Francisco, although the membership of this club, then as now, took a very liberal attitude toward ordinary lapses from the conventional moral code. How pure are your patriotic motives? You, Hearst, and the chief cultural exhibit on your staff of writers Arthur Brisbane appear to have divided the fertile field of armaments. You take the Navy and all types of warships, and Brisbane takes war aircraft. You are both insatiable, and your appetites for armament increases. Scarcely a day passes that Brisbane does not find some new and terrifying reason for an unlimited increase in the fighting and bombing planes for the Army and Navy. You, Hearst, and the editorial writers under your direction, yell continually for a larger navy, more battleships, more cruisers, more destroyers, more submarines, etc. If 10 new warships are authorized, you scream for 20. If 20 are authorized, you shriek for 40, and so on. The United States has the biggest peacetime appropriation both for aircraft and warships in its history. It is doubtful if the total appropriation, running close to $1 billion, has ever been equaled or exceeded by any nation or group of nations in a so-called peaceful period. Your constant demands for more and ever more armaments are so well known that quotations would be superfluous. You deliberately and systematically try to keep the populace in a state of constant alarm over the mythical danger of invasion. Would war add to your wealth? We are not concerned here with your right to advocate such measures, although you are one of the powerful individuals who menace the peace of the world, every issue of whose papers holds over the heads of millions of working people the menace of a new world slaughter for profits and new areas for robber expeditions. What we are concerned with here is the mixture of motives that may prompt you to this course. We know that you are an unscrupulous defender of the most reactionary policies of the capitalist system. But curiosity is aroused by the persistent vigor with which you carry on the campaign for ever larger armaments. Surely, Hearst, it would not be amiss for you, in the public interest, to answer truthfully, if you can, the following questions. Have you any considerable amount of stock in or bonds of 44 corporations that profit greatly from the manufacture of increased armaments? Has Arthur Brisbane any stock in or bonds of aircraft companies that would profit greatly from the carrying through of the aircraft program he advocates? Have you substantial interests in any concerns producing raw materials that would profit greatly from a major war? If you have any such investments, would it be too much to ask you to make them public? In other words, Hearst, can you give any guarantees at all, negative or positive, of the sublime purity and patriotism of your motives when you continually spew forth slander of the Soviet Union and its peace policy, campaign continually for fantastically large armaments in the air, on the land and the 2 oceans, and ceaselessly provoke the chief imperialist rivals of the billionaire ruling class of this country? Always for wars that other men fought. Your record, Hearst, speaks for itself. You, as much as any one man could be, were responsible for the Spanish-American War, the loss of life and the bitter nationalism and hatreds that grew out of it. Your infamous cable to the artist Remington in Cuba is a matter of public knowledge. You earnestly the pictures and I'll journish the war. You favored the brutal occupation of Haiti. You called for the occupation of Nicaragua. Only recently your papers in editorials and by war-inciting cartoons were demanding the construction of a new canal through Nicaragua. 1916, you, the reputed owner of some 1 million acres of land in Mexico, took the lead in the campaign that led to the invasion of the sister republic from the north, preceded by the bombardment and occupation of Tampico. You took the lead in this infamous imperialist adventure for which every American working man and woman, every Mexican worker and peasant, must suffer from the creation of a new series of nationalistic prejudices and hatreds. It is true that you opposed the entry of this country into the World War on the side of England and France. But only because you wanted American imperialism to support German imperialism as against British and French imperialism. But you quickly swung into line and outdid the Allied jingos in bloodthirstiness and in your drive against unpatriotic working men. 45. Who did not see why they should get shot up for the glory and profit of the House of Morgan. How to blunt your fangs all in all, Hearst, USA, away above the average of the leaders of your robber class in sheer undiluted anti-working class poison. What is to be done to blunt your fangs and reduce the potency of your verbal poison as much as possible? What we intend to do will be far more damaging to you, Hearst, both personally and as an outstanding representative of the innate and increasing rottenness of capitalism. We intend this little pamphlet is only a first step to collect all information on every act of your life that is relevant to the class struggle. There are scores of people who are now ready and willing to tell of that part of your career of skullduggery that they know about. In the aggregate, this will make a pretty exhaustive biography. We have the people who can carry out such an investigation. Some of them have worked for you at one time or another and in this special task that will be far from a handicap. We will publish this material. We intend to strip your leprous, jingo, profit-worshipping, ghoulish soul bare before the people of this country. If you get our legal press suppressed, as you are trying to, we will find other means of publishing it. To us it is a sacred revolutionary duty placed on us by your vile lies about Lenin and the rest of our glorious dead, and your slanders and provocations against the organized labor movement, the working class, and its communist sections in all countries who took the torch of freedom forward no matter what the cost. If, when we have held your scabrous career up for all the world to see, you feel impelled, by your own hood, to rid the world of the livid menace of your fascist presence, it will be all right, believe me, with hundreds of thousands of workers, farmers, intellectuals, and other decent people, and, sincerely, with William F. Dunne. 46. The following dispatch, published in the Daily Worker and given to the capitalist press on February 26 to 27, shows that Hearst's anti-Soviet lies were refuted by the head 01 his own Moscow News Bureau. Moscow, February 6. Mr. Lindsay Parrott, the Moscow correspondent of the International News Service and the Universal Service, both of which belong to William Randolph Hearst, recently returned from a trip to South Ukrainian USSR. In a talk with a representative of Izvestia, Mr. Parrott gave his impressions of the trip. He said, "In the summer of last year I visited the Volga region from Astrakhan to Saratov. I visited the Friedrich Engels Kolkhoz in Markstadt and one of the fishing kolkhozes, whose good organization, order, and cleanliness astonished me. I have recently completed a trip to other important agricultural regions of the Soviet Union to the South Ukraine where I saw new kolkhozes. This second trip made an even greater impression than the first. Nowhere in any of the towns or villages on the way did I see signs or traces of the famine about which the foreign press likes to speak. Moreover, the present is the very time of the year when famine, if existent, would sharply appear. I visited kolkhozes not according to the prearranged plan. During my stay in the Odessa region, I spent a whole day in the villages of the kolkhozes, Groliebental and Kleinliebental, in the Spartakov district. I happened by chance to sit at the dinner table of a kolkhoznik and taste kolkhoz food. I was returning to town by automobile, which got stuck in deep snow. We could not proceed and it was necessary to return to the kolkhoz. Naturally the kolkhoznik did not expect us, but we met with a hearty welcome, hospitality, and a good supper. We were treated to pickled herring with onions, vegetables, pork schnitzel with egg, and coffee. We also tasted good kolkhoz wine. The kolkhozniks of Groliebental probably lived better last year, when there was no drought, than this year, but at the present they are living like average peasants, who have sufficient. Moreover, I found that 80% of the peasants of Groly Ebental were poor peasants before collectivization. The percentage of poor peasants corresponded approximately to the percentage of illiterates. Now, in Kleinly Ebental, for instance, 10 schools have been established and there are no illiterates. The village is clean, with trim, well-built houses, painted in various gay colors. They 47 kolkhozniks are dressed quite well. Their horses are in good shape and seemingly are well attended and cared for. All machinery is in sheds, sheltered from bad weather. The number of livestock in the kolkhoz increased from 3,500 head to 5,000 head in 2 years. In these villages we heard the sound of church bells, which are no longer heard in the cities. Lutheran and Catholic churches continue to exist. Mr. Parrott finished his talk, which lasted nearly an hour, with the following phrase: "I don't know how the Kolaks feel, but 1 am convinced that the poor peasants in the kolkhozes have begun to lead a well-to-do life.